If you're watching this right now, I need you to do something for me before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button, not because I'm asking nicely, but because what you're about to hear might actually save your life if you ever find yourself in a cabin so cold that your breath freezes to the pillow. I'm dead serious. This isn't another clickbait survival story. This is about a woman who slept 18 degrees Celsius, warmer than the air around her, while the world outside tried to kill her with cold. And she did it with clay, fire, and a stubbornness that made grown men shake their heads and call her insane. So subscribe, because you're going to want to remember this channel when winter comes knocking and your heating bill makes you cry. The cabin sat at the edge of a valley where the wind came down like a fist. November had barely started, and already the mornings arrived with frost so thick it looked like someone had painted the windows white from the outside. She could see her breath indoors. Not just in the morning, all day, all night. The wood stove in the corner worked hard, eating through logs like a hungry animal, but the moment you stepped 3 feet away from it, the cold wrapped around you like water. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning shaking so hard her teeth clattered. The blankets helped, piling them on until she could barely move underneath, but it was never enough. The cold came up through the floor. It pressed down from the ceiling. It lived in the walls, and the worst part, the part that made her lie there staring at the dark ceiling with burning eyes, was knowing that the real winter hadn't even started yet. This was just the preview. January and February were still coming, and they'd be worse. Much worse. She'd grown up hearing stories about the old country, about grandmothers who slept on top of brick ovens, about Korean kang beds and Russian pechkas, these massive clay and stone structures that people built into their homes, not just for cooking, but for sleeping. The idea was simple enough in theory. Fire makes heat. Most of that heat goes straight up the chimney and disappears into the sky. But what if you could catch it first? What if you could make the smoke and hot air travel through channels, through tunnels in clay or brick, letting that thermal mass soak up the heat and then radiate it slowly, gently, all through the night? The clay would stay warm for hours after the fire went out. You could sleep on top of it. Your body would be warm even if the air around you was freezing. The concept made sense. The physics checked out. Thermal mass, heat retention, radiant warmth versus convective heat loss. She'd read about it online during the days when the cabin still had internet, before the cold got so bad that the router froze and stopped working. She'd sketched diagrams on paper. She'd watched blurry videos of people in Mongolia and Siberia sleeping on heated platforms. It could work. It had to work. But when she mentioned it to the neighbors, to the handful of people who lived within shouting distance in this isolated valley, they looked at her like she'd suggested building a rocket ship out of cardboard. Old Martin from 2 properties over actually laughed, a dry wheezing sound that turned into a cough. You're going to build an oven bed. In your cabin. With what? Clay from the creek. And you think you won't burn the whole place down or suffocate yourself in your sleep? He shook his head. That's how people die, he said. Carbon monoxide doesn't smell like anything. You just go to sleep and don't wake up. His wife nodded in agreement, her arms crossed. Get more blankets, she said, or move somewhere warmer. This isn't the Stone Age. She tried to explain that it wasn't the same as just having a fire in the room, that the whole point was to store the heat safely in thermal mass, to keep the fire controlled and the exhaust properly vented, but they'd already dismissed her. The young woman in the freezing cabin with the crazy ideas. Let her learn the hard way. The problem was that she didn't have another option. Moving wasn't possible. The cabin was all she had, inherited from an uncle who'd lived here for 40 years before he died, and left it to her with a handwritten note that said, "Use it or lose it." She'd used it. She'd moved in during summer when the valley was green and beautiful, and the cold seemed like an abstract concept. Now winter was here, and she understood why the place had been empty for 2 years before she arrived. No one wanted to live somewhere this cold unless they had no choice, and she had no choice. So she started gathering materials. Clay from the creek bed mixed with sand to prevent cracking, stones from the hillside, flat ones that could form channels, bricks salvaged from an old collapsed chimney she found half a mile into the woods. She carried them back in a backpack that made her shoulders ache. She wasn't a mason. She wasn't an engineer. She was a woman with cold feet and a stubborn refusal to give up. The first attempt was a disaster. She built a low platform in the corner opposite the wood stove, forming channels with bricks and covering them with a thick layer of clay, mixed with straw for binding. The idea was to connect a small fire pit at one end with a chimney at the other, letting the hot smoke travel through the channels before escaping outside. Simple in theory. In practice, the moment she lit a test fire, smoke poured back into the cabin. She'd gotten the draft wrong. The chimney wasn't tall enough, or the channels were too long or too narrow, or both. She couldn't breathe. Her eyes streamed with tears. She threw open the door and windows, letting in air so cold it felt like knives, and watched as the smoke finally cleared. The clay platform sat there looking innocent, but she knew it was mocking her. She tore it apart the next day, salvaged what she could, and started over. The second attempt was smarter. She researched draft and draw, the way hot air rises and creates suction. She made the chimney taller, adding sections of salvaged pipe she sealed with furnace cement. She widened the channels slightly and angled them to encourage flow. She built a small firebox at the entrance, just big enough for a handful of small wood pieces, designed to burn hot and fast rather than smolder. This time, when she lit it, the smoke hesitated for a moment and then rushed up and out, pulled by the draft. She felt the bricks start to warm under her hand. It was working. She fed the fire slowly, carefully, watching for any sign of backdraft or carbon monoxide, keeping a window cracked for ventilation. The platform grew warm, not scalding, but warm enough to feel through her jeans when she sat on it. She let the fire burn down to coals and then die completely. 2 hours later, the surface was still warm. 4 hours later, still warm. She put her cheek against the clay and felt stored heat radiating into her skin. But there were problems. The clay cracked as it dried, long spiderweb fractures that made her heart sink. She sealed them with more clay slip, patching and repatching. The platform needed to cure properly, to dry slowly without splitting apart, but the cabin was cold and damp, and the drying process took weeks. She couldn't use it yet. Meanwhile, December arrived and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The water in the bucket by the door froze solid overnight. She woke up one morning to find ice on the inside of the windows, delicate fern patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented how desperately cold it was in here. She wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed: long underwear, 2 pairs of socks, a hat, gloves with the fingers cut off so she could still turn pages if she tried to read before sleeping. She buried herself under 4 blankets and a sleeping bag, and still shivered. The wood stove couldn't keep up. She'd feed it at midnight, and by 3 in the morning the fire would be down to coals and the cold would sink its teeth in again. She kept working on the platform. She fired it slowly, carefully, with tiny fires that barely produced flame, just heat, trying to drive out the moisture without shocking the clay into more cracks. She sealed every gap she could find. She tested the draft constantly, making sure the smoke went where it was supposed to go. She bought a carbon monoxide detector, with money she didn't have, mounting it on the wall above where her head would be when she slept. She wasn't stupid. She knew the risks. Carbon monoxide was colorless, odorless, and deadly. People died every year from badly vented heaters and blocked chimneys, but people also died from hypothermia, from freezing to death in their own homes because they couldn't afford to stay warm. She'd take her chances with the detector and proper ventilation over another month of sleeping in clothes cold enough to make her joints ache. The platform was about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide when she finished it, big enough for her to lie down with room to spare. The surface was smooth clay mixed with fine sand, hardened by repeated gentle firing. Underneath, the channels ran in a serpentine pattern, allowing hot smoke to travel the length of the structure before exiting through the chimney. The firebox was at the foot end, accessed through a small iron door she'd salvaged from an old potbelly stove. The whole thing had taken her nearly 2 months to build. By the time she was ready to actually sleep on it, the valley was deep into winter. The snow had come, 3 feet of it, then 4, then more. The road was impassable. The nearest neighbor was a 40-minute walk through drifts that came up to her thighs. She was alone with her creation, this massive clay monster in the corner, and everyone who'd heard about it thought she was going to die. The first real test came on a night when the temperature outside dropped to -20°C. She checked it on the thermometer she kept nailed to the cabin's exterior wall, reading it through the window, because stepping outside for even a minute meant coming back in with painful fingers and a face that felt flash-frozen. Inside, with the wood stove burning, the cabin air temperature was around 4°C, cold enough that she could see her breath, cold enough that water left in a cup would have ice on it by morning. She built a fire in the platform's firebox, small pieces of very dry wood that burned hot and clean. She watched the smoke draw perfectly up through the channels and out the chimney. She felt the clay begin to warm. She fed the fire for 2 hours, letting the thermal mass soak up heat, and then let it burn down completely to ash. She sealed the firebox door. She checked the CO detector, green and silent. She cracked a window 1/2 inch for fresh air circulation, and then she lay down on top of the platform with a thin blanket under her and a thicker one over her. The warmth came up from below like a gentle hand. It pressed into her back, her shoulders, the back of her legs. It was nothing like the fierce blast of heat from the wood stove, which burned your face while your back stayed cold. This was different. This was radiant heat, steady and even, surrounding her body from underneath. She could feel her muscles unknot, tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying draining away. Her feet, which were always cold, always aching, began to warm. Not burning hot, just warm, comfortable, human. She lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, and realized she wasn't shivering. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't shaking with cold. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and felt the warmth beneath her and thought, this is it, this is what I needed, this is going to work. She woke up 6 hours later naturally, not from cold, but from the simple fact that she'd slept enough. The cabin air was still freezing, her breath was still visible, but she was warm. The platform had cooled slightly, but was still radiating heat, still comfortable. She reached out from under the blanket and felt the air temperature with her hand, then compared it to the warmth under her blanket and against her body. The difference was staggering. She grabbed the thermometer she kept by her bedside and measured. The cabin air was 2°C. The surface of the clay platform was 21 degrees. Under her blanket, in the microclimate created by her body heat and the platform's radiant warmth, it was 20 degrees. She did the math twice to make sure. She was sleeping in an environment 18 degrees warmer than the air around her. 18 degrees. That was the difference between suffering and comfort. That was the difference between survival and hypothermia. But it wasn't perfect yet. The platform cooled too quickly. By morning it was only barely warm, the stored heat depleted. She needed to fire it twice, once before bed and once in the middle of the night, which meant waking up to feed wood into the firebox. And there were other problems. The clay dried out the air, making her throat scratchy. The smoke smell clung to everything, even though the draft was working perfectly. And then there was the moisture issue. The platform absorbed humidity from the air and from her breath, making the clay slightly damp and reducing its insulation value. She had to fire it daily just to drive out the moisture, even when she didn't need the heat. It was more work than she'd expected, more maintenance, more attention. The valley noticed when she stopped complaining about the cold. Old Martin saw her outside one morning in January, clearing snow from the path, and commented that she looked healthier, less pinched, less grey. She told him about the platform, about the measurements, about sleeping 18 degrees warmer. He squinted at her like she was speaking another language. That clay oven thing actually worked, he asked, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite disbelief, but wasn't quite acceptance either. She nodded. It works, she said. I'm not freezing anymore. I sleep through the night. His wife appeared in their doorway, arms crossed, and called out asking if she was burning too much wood, if she was worried about carbon monoxide, if she understood how dangerous it was to sleep next to fire. She explained again, patiently, that there was no fire while she slept, only stored heat in the clay, and that she had a detector and ventilation. The wife shook her head and went back inside. But Martin stood there for a moment longer, looking thoughtful. 3 days later, there was a knock on her door. It was Martin and another neighbor, a younger guy named Thomas who lived alone in a trailer on the far side of the valley. Thomas looked rough, his face wind-chapped, and his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep. He said his propane heater had died, and he couldn't afford to replace it, that he was burning through firewood like crazy and still waking up frozen. Martin had told him about the platform. Could she show him how she built it? Could she explain the principle so he could try something similar? She invited them in, made weak tea from the last of her supply, and walked them through the design, the thermal mass concept, the importance of proper draft, the need for a CO detector and ventilation, the curing process, the maintenance. Thomas took notes on the back of an envelope, his handwriting shaky from cold. He asked smart questions about channel width and chimney height. He understood the physics better than she'd expected. When they left, Martin paused at the door and said quietly that he was sorry for laughing at her before, that he'd been wrong to dismiss the idea. She nodded, not quite forgiving, but not quite angry either. She was too tired for anger. February brought the worst of the winter, a week of storms that piled snow up to the cabin's windows, that made the wind shriek like something alive trying to get in. The temperature dropped to -30 outside. Inside, even with the wood stove running constantly, the cabin air barely stayed above freezing. But on her platform, under her blankets, surrounded by radiant clay heat, she was comfortable. She fired the platform twice a day now, morning and evening, feeding it just enough wood to heat the thermal mass without creating unnecessary smoke or risk. She'd gotten better at reading the clay, at knowing when it needed more heat and when it needed to rest. She'd learned to monitor the moisture levels, to keep the surface dry, to prevent cracks from forming during rapid temperature changes. It was a relationship almost, her and this massive warm presence in the corner. She talked to it sometimes when the isolation got too heavy. "You're keeping me alive," she'd say, patting the warm surface. "Don't quit on me now." The power went out during the worst of the storms. The entire valley went dark. No electricity for heating or light or communication. She lit candles and lanterns, rationed her food, kept the wood stove burning as her only link to civilization. The platform became even more critical. Without it, she would have had to stay awake all night feeding the wood stove, burning through her entire winter's supply of wood in a matter of days. With it, she could let the wood stove die down during the night, saving fuel, knowing that the platform would keep her core temperature safe. She measured again during one of those dark nights, curiosity making her reach for the thermometer. Cabin air -1 degree Celsius, water in the cup frozen solid, platform surface 19 degrees, under her blankets 22 degrees, a 23-degree difference. She was sleeping in what was essentially a different climate zone, a pocket of warmth that shouldn't exist in a cabin this cold, but did because of clay and fire and thermal mass. When the storms finally broke and the sun came back, weak and pale through clearing clouds, Thomas showed up at her door again. He'd built his own platform, he said, in the trailer, smaller than hers, rougher, but functional. He was sleeping warm for the first time all winter. He wanted to thank her. He'd brought a bag of dried beans as payment, as trade, and she accepted them gratefully, because her food supplies were running low, and she didn't know when she'd be able to get to town. He asked if she'd come look at his setup, make sure he wasn't doing anything dangerous. She went, trudging through snow that had started to crust over in the brief warming, and examined his work. It was crude but effective, the channels wider than they needed to be, but the draft working well. She made suggestions about sealing some gaps, about adding height to his chimney for better draw. He nodded, taking it all in, and then said something that surprised her. "You change things here," he said. "People are talking about this, about how you figured something out that the rest of us missed, about how you survived when we thought you'd quit and leave." She didn't know what to say to that. She'd just been trying not to freeze to death. She hadn't thought about it as changing anything, but word spread. By late February, 3 more people in the valley had built some version of a heated sleeping platform. Old Martin and his wife did one together, working slowly but carefully, following the principles she'd explained. A woman from the far end of the valley, someone she'd never even met, sent her husband over with questions and measurements. People started calling it the clay bed, the oven bed, the warm stone, different names for the same basic idea. They compared notes about wood consumption, about how long the heat lasted, about different clay mixtures and stone arrangements. It became a community project without anyone planning it that way. The thing that had made her seem crazy 3 months ago was now spreading through the valley like a practical solution to a shared problem. She found herself in the odd position of being sought out for advice, this woman who'd arrived just months ago and been dismissed as naive and unprepared. Winter finally loosened its grip in March. The temperatures crept up, hitting 0 and then above. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, and then in rushing streams that turned the valley floor to mud. She still fired the platform most nights because the cabin stayed cold long after the daytime temperatures rose, but she didn't need to fire it twice anymore. Once a night was enough. Sometimes she'd skip a night and just use extra blankets, giving herself a break from the maintenance. But she never slept as well those nights. Her body had adapted to the radiant warmth, had come to expect it, and sleeping without it felt like a deprivation. The platform had become part of her routine, part of her home, part of how she survived. She did the final measurements on the last cold night of the season, a late March frost that caught everyone by surprise. Outside temperature -5, inside cabin air 3 degrees, platform surface 18 degrees, under blankets 21 degrees, still an 18-degree difference, still that same margin of survival and comfort that the platform had given her all winter. She wrote the numbers down in the notebook where she'd been tracking temperatures since December, looking at the columns of data, the proof that this had worked, that she'd built something functional and safe that had kept her alive through the worst winter the valley had seen in 10 years. The neighbors had called her crazy. Old Martin had laughed. His wife had warned about carbon monoxide, and they'd been right to be concerned, right to question, because what she'd done was risky and unconventional and could have gone terribly wrong if she'd been careless. But she hadn't been careless. She'd been desperate and thorough and willing to learn from failures. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The valley turned green. The cabin warmed naturally during the day from sunlight alone. She stopped firing the platform entirely and let it cool down completely for the first time since December. The clay was scarred now, marked by months of heating and cooling cycles, spiderweb cracks sealed with patches of fresh clay, darker streaks where moisture had condensed and dried over and over. It looked old, used, weathered. It looked like something that had done its job. She ran her hand over the surface, feeling the texture, remembering the nights when this mass of clay and stone had been the only thing standing between her and hypothermia. She didn't tear it down. She left it there in the corner, ready for next winter, because next winter would come and she'd need it again. The valley was different now, too. People greeted her on the path. They asked questions about curing time and wood selection. They shared their own modifications and improvements. Thomas had added a cooking surface to his platform, turning it into a dual-purpose structure. Old Martin's wife admitted that she slept better now, that her arthritis hurt less when she was warm all night. The woman from the far end of the valley came to visit in person, bringing fresh eggs and asking about channel design. A community had formed around this simple idea, around the rediscovery of an ancient technology that most of them had never heard of before: thermal mass heating. Radiant warmth, the kind of passive solar design that didn't need electricity or expensive equipment, just clay and fire and patience. She sat on the platform one evening in late April, the surface cool now under her jeans, and thought about what she'd learned, about thermal mass and heat retention, about draft and smoke management, about the difference between heating air and heating surfaces, about how the human body responds to radiant warmth versus convective heat, but also about community and persistence, about the value of old knowledge in new circumstances, about what happens when you refuse to accept freezing as inevitable. The cabin had seemed impossible to heat when she'd first arrived, a drafty wooden box that bled warmth faster than she could generate it. Now she knew better. The air would always be cold, but she didn't have to be. The thermal mass beneath her could store enough heat from a few hours of careful firing to keep her comfortable all night. It was physics, simple and elegant, and it had saved her life. The video on her phone, when she finally had internet again, showed a rough-looking woman with wind-chapped skin and serious eyes, explaining how she'd built a clay sleeping platform in a freezing cabin. She watched it once, then deleted it, deciding she didn't need to share this story with strangers. But then Thomas asked if she'd write down the instructions, maybe make a guide that people could follow, because he knew others who were struggling with heating costs, with cold homes, with the impossible choice between food and warmth. She thought about it for a week and then started writing. Not a step-by-step tutorial, because every situation was different and following instructions blindly could get someone killed. But a guide to the principles, to thermal mass and draft and safety considerations, to the importance of CO detectors and ventilation, to the reality that this wasn't easy but it was possible, that people had been doing versions of this for thousands of years, that sometimes the old ways worked better than anything modern. So here we are, you've heard the story. You know what happened. A woman in a freezing cabin built a clay platform, filled it with channels, heated it with fire, and slept 18 degrees warmer than the air around her all winter long. People called her crazy until it worked, and then they called her smart, and then they built their own versions. That's how change happens sometimes, one stubborn person refusing to freeze, one impossible idea that turns out to be possible after all. If you're still watching, if you made it all the way to the end, I need you to understand something. This isn't about whether you should build one of these. That's your decision based on your situation, your skills, your safety considerations. This is about not accepting suffering as inevitable. This is about the fact that humans have survived winter for millennia using nothing but clay and stone and fire, and that knowledge hasn't disappeared just because we have central heating now. When the power fails, when the heating bill is impossible, when you're shivering in your own home, remember that there are other options, old options, tested options, dangerous if done carelessly, but effective if done right. Before you go, I need you to do one more thing. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Seriously, this channel exists to share stories like this, knowledge like this, the kind of practical survival information that might matter when modern convenience fails. And modern convenience fails more often than we want to admit. The next video might be about water purification, or food preservation, or emergency shelter, but it'll be real, it'll be tested, and it'll be something you can actually use. So subscribe. Leave a comment telling me if you've ever tried something everyone said was impossible. And stay warm out there, whatever method you choose, because winter comes for all of us eventually, and the only question that matters is whether you're ready.